Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am the Darklight Emissary, and today's episode continues our series on the Legion Doctrines and Tactics. And the Legion today is the 9th Legion, the Blood Angels Legion. Now, this Legion, at its height for power, topped out at about 150,000 Space Marines. And they are, if you know anything about the Blood Angels, from reading the Pre-Heresy books, during the Heresy and before it, at the height of the Great Crusade, the Blood Angels were probably one of the pillar legions. What I mean by that is they were often exemplified for their bravery, their nobility, and, the beauty and nobility of their Primarch, Sanguinius. But this legion saw one of the biggest changes as a legion from early on to where they end up at the end of the Great Crusade. And so we're going to spend a bit of time talking about who they were in the early days of the Great Crusade. This legion spent quite a few years without their Primarch, and before the coming of Sanguinius, they were known as the Revenant Legion, and they had a much different bearing and demeanor and even purpose than they did after Sanguinius took command of them. This was a legion that, unlike many legions that would pick the best and brightest of a nobility or of a people, would actually pick the dredges of society. Even like straight up mutants would be considered as possible recruits for this legion, and they would be transformed into the angelic form that Blood Angels are kind of known as. They are kind of given over to being kind of considered beautiful in a sense, in their own way, in form, but certainly not in function as the Revenant Legion. And the Revenant Legion was basically the Emperor's own set of monsters. The Legion had a very simple structure and was basically ran by warlords instead of by, anything considered a captain or true leader or strategy even. The Legion was often sent to take out monsters that the Imperium ran into. If there was a horrifying situation, the Emperor would send his own horrors in the form of the Revenant Legion to be unleashed upon them until nothing remained. And one of the most unique traits of this legion that kept it running far longer than pretty much any other legion was this legion utilized their ability to eat the flesh of their enemies, and through doing that, they would gain the memories of their enemy, including skills even, to the point where they used it to learn about their enemy and even gain strategic glimpses of their enemy. A very invaluable trait, often looked down upon by other Space Marine legions and other Imperium forces, despite the fact that most Space Marine legions of the day, if not all of them, had the ability to do this. For whatever reason, the Revenant Legion relied upon this more so than the rest. And one of the other unique traits of the Revenant Legion is when a captain or other leader of the Legion would die, whoever would take the role of that leader would also consume the flesh of the previous leader and even his name. And so technically that leader would live on through the new leader, because that leader would gain all the thoughts and knowledge and experience from his previous commander. And so they had probably some actually pretty valuable leaders in the early Legion that were relying on the strategy to retain a lot of knowledge instead of it being lost if that leader died. Now, in part of my research, I came across a really great story about the Revenant Legion in the early Crusade. I couldn't quite see on the source or what the source was for this story. So if any of you know and want to leave it in the comments, if it's a short story or novella in the Horus Heresy era, I certainly haven't read it, but it's about the Revenant Legion, and I'll talk a little bit about it here because it talks a lot about how this legion early fought on. They were basically sent, 3 companies worth were sent to a backwater world, basically, that a few Imperial army regiments disappeared on. There was no signs of them. So they sent 3 companies of Revenant Legion there, and they found a world completely ruled by this mutant king, and he had basically endless swarms of mutants, as well as enslaved psychers of some, or sorcerers of some kind of power, that were basically opening up portals to the warp and allowing demons through. It doesn't quite say that, but that's pretty much what was going on. And so these beleaguered Imperial Army troops were relieved by the Revenant Legion, dropping onto the world. However, eventually the Revenant Legion got bogged down by the sheer amount of mutants that they were fighting against. And so they got so bogged down that they spent 12 years protracting this war against this mutant king without resupply, basically. So this legion basically ended up recruiting from the current tribes of mutants on the world into servitude of the legion, and even elevated some of these mutants to be space marines. As I said earlier, the Revenant Legion had no problem with accepting mutants as potential candidates as space marines. Some of them worked out. And so in this way, this legion was fighting not only with a savagery and endurance that most legions, I would say, have probably, but a lot of legions would have been too proud to implant their gene seed into a mutant. It just wouldn't have happened. The Revenant Legion had no such hangups, and they did that. And so they were able to eventually defeat this mutant king without defeat, but long past when they had anything aiming at Imperial supplies given to them. And so they were able to eventually conquer this world through just sheer savagery and ability to replenish their numbers. And I've never quite seen that in any of the other legions, that kind of endurance level. Now, it's not really a thing that they did later on. However, I imagine if the later Blood Angels Legion were simply or similarly put into a corner like this, that they would have no problem with eventually having to do this again in the future. There's one thing I've noticed about both the Revenant Legion and Blood Angels is that they are a legion that has a very proud sense about themselves, but it's not a arrogant pride. The Blood Angels are kind of like, they are, in a sense, they have this nobility and sense of we are very good at what we do, but they are not arrogant in a sense that some of the other legions put off. At least everything I've ever, it's a supreme confidence. Sanguinius himself was often kind of considered a second choice as War Master over Horus because he made few enemies amongst his brothers. Sanguinius was seen as a great warrior and politician and commander in general. He had a lot of the traits that Horus had, and Sanguinius was often very confident in his ability, but not a very prideful soul, I would say. And he definitely brought that to his legion. And so eventually, when Sanguinius was reunited with his legion, at that point, he was basically able to temper the more savage parts of the Revenant Legion and bring into it a more tempered and organized sense of self for the legion. Gone, instead of just going into an enemy world and savagely bludgeoning it to death, the legion would put a lot more tactical and strategic firepower and planning behind it than they did in the past. And overall, their natures were buried beneath layers of better training that Sanguinius provided, as well as providing with them different ways, different outlets to focus away their energies, basically. Like, he had them become scholars and artists. And if you were to ever walk the halls of one of their grand ships, you would see aboard them many sculptures and tapestries and things like that, all made by Space Marines. And it wasn't some kind of vainglorious thing. This was part of their doctrines and strategies to keep their darker urges under wraps. It was a kind of a psychological ploy by Sanguinius. So, unlike someone like the Emperor's Children, who were basically kind of vainglorious and kind of full of themselves a little bit to an extent. A very great legion in their own respect, but the Blood Angels had that opulence without being considered arrogant, I would say, which was an interesting balance that they struck with themselves. Now, despite the temperance that Sanguinius did bring to his legion, as a overall force, this legion was definitely one of the more powerful legions and also one of the most uncompromising. They would basically give worlds one chance to comply, and if they did not comply, the entire legion would be unleashed upon that world, and they would not stop until everything before them was a smoke and ruin. They often brought into battle for war gear, weapons like melta weapons, and other shock and awe style tactics, because their goal was to basically shock the enemy into surrendering and kneeling before their might. Their entire goal was to show in a very aggressive and fast fashion reasons why you would comply and why surrender was a good idea at that point. Some of the tactics of this legion saw influence from the Sons of Horus legion, the Luna Wolves legion of Horus Lupercal, and some of that definitely rubbed off on this legion. They spent about 10 years fighting and learning from that legion, along with their Primarch, so some of their traits can come back to those roots from working with them. Sanguinius was not against basically adapting different abilities to his legion as needed. He would organize his forces into great hosts, and each of these hosts would have a specific purpose strategically and tactically. And then once that strategy was over with, they would break up that host and reorganize it again. And so Sanguinius was constantly deploying his forces in different ways according to the needs of a specific area. This legion, despite having a favor towards close range combat and weaponry, was never one that was typecast into one specific fighting style. The biggest through point for this legion is that once they were unleashed, they were max aggression the entire time they were fighting, whether that's with melee weapons or with ranged weaponry. Their savagery and their fury was always apparent, but they were often great leaders and often bastions of example to those around them. And this was very apparent, especially during this Siege of Terra. If you ever have a chance to read any of those books, the Blood Angels are one of the 3 legions protecting the Imperial Palace. And we really get to see in those books these legionnaires of the Blood Angels being those islands of calm in a sea of mortal souls, in a sea of regular soldiers. You know, these soldiers would have their courage bulwarked up by the presence of these Blood Angels willing to fight alongside, these soldiers. And these Blood Angels would never seem to look upon the Imperial soldiers that they were fighting alongside as lesser to them. If anything, I always saw kind of a quiet respect amongst professionals type of thing that the Blood Angels kind of exuded towards those lesser than them, which is also another interesting trait about them. They never really saw themselves as kind of arrogantly elevated above humanity like some of the other legions often would. Despite the savage and very powerful defense they put up at the Siege of Terra towards the end of the Legion eras, this Legion was definitely not known for exactly being a defensive Legion per se. However, as I mentioned earlier in that story about them as a Revenant Legion, if they did have to dig down and stay in a spot for a very long time, we know this Legion could if they wanted to and were forced to in the future. Other than that, not much is really said about armor about them. I mean, they have armored support. They did have armored units that they could use, like any of the legions could, and they did use those. The Legion did boast a pretty powerful fleet of over 300 capital class warships, a lot of heavy cruisers and battleships, including, of course, Sanguinius's Gloriana class battleship, and they often use these to great effect for support of their legions with aggressive, preemptive strikes, as well as, complete obliteration of enemy targets. This all being said, something of note, Sanguinius also taught his legion. There was a few times where Sanguinius would force worlds into compliance through bloodless means, and it doesn't exactly detail how he would do that, but he often showed his men that there was ways to negotiate enemy surrender without just savagely destroying a world, even if this legion was known for its uncompromising fury in those situations. And so this has been a bit about the Blood Angels Legion tactics and strategies. As always, if you've liked this, please leave a like. Please subscribe if you'd like to help this channel grow and get more successful. So far, so good. It's been really cool to see the channel grow a bit over time. Leave a comment if you'd like to discuss this legion or anything about it, or request a future video on any topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts. A little bit later tonight, I'll probably be streaming. I do like to stream some games, and lately we've been playing the Dead Space remake. I'm currently practicing for an impossible run on that, so there should be a community post for that stream a bit later on tonight when that is about to go live on the gaming channel, Darklight Gaming. If you do stop by, you're totally welcome to ask me any questions Warhammer related, even if the game I'm playing is not Warhammer related. I always welcome a chance to talk about this universe with anyone that would like to, live while I'm doing something else. So as always, bring your light into the dark places. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you in the next video. The next chapter, or I should say legion, chapter up that we have is the 8th Legion, which is the Night Lord's Legion, which will be a fun one to be talking about. I've been reading their omnibus lately. Have a great day or night wherever you are, and we will talk soon. Thank you.